Good evening. My name is Betty Tonsing. I'm a member of the Indiana Council of World Affairs. We'd like to welcome you back again this month. Our program this month, we're very glad you joined us. I think you're going to like this program. This is the second program of our 24-25 program year for the Global Speaker Series. For those of you who have been with us for some time, you may remember that this is our new series name for what used to be called Distinguished Speakers. And for those of you who are new, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Again, for those of you who have been with us for a long time, you may remember we started the calendar year in January with a program on what we called religious extremism. We could have called it Christian nationalism, but we still wanted to keep the name rather global because this is a trend, a problem that was going on in other parts of the world that were civil societies, that were democracies, that were going through a series of increased nationalism, populism, that also included anti-immigrant views as well as some religious fervor that we've not seen for a while, and particularly within a Christian movement. And after the program, many of you said that you'd like to have another program like it. We could have gone on many hours that night with it. In fact, I want to say now we're going to have a nightcap session with this one. And we remind you of that. We've only done this a couple of times with programs that have been very well attended, that people are highly interested in. The program will end officially at 8:30. But for those of you who would like to stay on just a bit longer, we're going to have a nightcap session. And that means you go to your locker and get a glass of water, get a glass of wine, beer, whatever you like, come back and join us. And we will have just a brief discussion for some 15 or 20 or so minutes longer on this, because people do want to talk about this, and what our panelists are going to talk about tonight will prompt even more conversation. So this is going to be a program. I'm so glad you've joined us. This will be a serious program. You asked for another of this in January, and here we are. And Ray, if you would please introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Betty. I want to add my welcome to everyone tonight. Just as a reminder, the ICWA, Indiana Council on World Affairs, is committed to bringing topics of importance to members in the greater community. I want to thank all of you who are members for your support. For everyone else, if you find our programs interesting and our mission worthwhile, I urge you to join our organization as a member. You can do so by going to our website at indianaworld.org for links to join the organization. Just as a reminder, tonight's program will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. Let me introduce our speakers now. First, Sheila Kennedy is an Emerita Professor of Law and Public Policy at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Indianapolis. Until her retirement, she was a faculty fellow with both the Center for Religion and American Culture and the Tobias Center for Leadership Excellence. An adjunct professor of political science and founder of the Center for Civic Literacy at ICWA. She's published numerous books, book chapters and articles in scholarly journals and law reviews, including Free Expression in America, A Documentary History of God and Country, America in Red and Blue, Talking Politics, What You Need to Know Before You Open Your Mouth. That sounds like an interesting topic there. In addition to popular daily blogs, Sheila has been a columnist for the Indianapolis Star, Inequality Log, the Indiana Word, and the Indianapolis Business Journal. Our second panelist is Reverend Beau Underwood. He's a senior minister at Allisonville Christian Church, which is part of the Disciples of Christ in Indianapolis, and he's been there since 2023. In addition to his congregational ministry, he has past experience working in social justice advocacy, hospital chaplaincy, and religious media. He's an alum of Eureka College and the University of Chicago. Currently, he's a doctoral candidate in public affairs at the University of Missouri and Columbia. He is co-author of Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. His writing has appeared in the Christian Century, Sojourners, Word and Way, Religious Unplugged, Religion and News Service, and Religion and Politics. Our moderator tonight is Don Knebel. Don earned his degree in electrical engineering from Purdue. We may wonder how that has anything to do with religion, but he can explain that. He's an intellectual property litigator. Since 2011, he's been an adjunct professor and senior advisor at the Center for Intellectual Property Research at Indiana University Maurer School of Law, teaching antitrust law and patent litigation. He was recently recognized as 2024 Adjunct Professor of the Year. Don has served on numerous boards and community committees throughout the city and state, and has received several recognitions for his service. Don has traveled extensively in Europe and Asia. And for those of you who may see the Current and Carmel, he's got a regular column in there about his travel experiences. Don is a frequent speaker on religious and political history, comparative religion, politics, and the First Amendment. In 2015, he was named Interfaith Ambassador of the Year by the Center for Interfaith Cooperation, an organization he helped found in 2012. I'll now turn it over to Don to begin our program.
Well, thanks, Ray. So it's obvious that the whole idea of religious nationalism seems very current and important to people who have joined this call. But the fact is, this issue has been developing for a long time. As Ray said, in 2012, I helped start the Center for Interfaith Cooperation, the goal of bringing people of different faith traditions together. And in that connection, as the first board chair of CIC, I published an op-ed in the Indianapolis Star on August the 16th, 2012, 12 years ago. And here's what I wrote to conclude that. As our founding fathers recognized, a real American is not defined by religious beliefs. A real American believes, regardless of his or her faith tradition, in the ideal of religious pluralism and freedom upon which our country was founded, and which continues to draw to our shores people with many religious beliefs and practices. Is that ideal that we as Americans have in common, whether we were born Methodist in rural Indiana or to any other religious tradition in any other part of the world? Those who attack that ideal are attacking the very essence of what holds us together and makes us great. But unfortunately, as we all know, this ideal of religious pluralism is being attacked with more and more success. Before we get to the panel discussion, I want to provide a little recent background for those discussions. On June the 19th, 2024, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry signed into law a bill requiring all Louisiana public classrooms from elementary schools to universities to display a copy of the Ten Commandments. The sponsor of a similar bill in Oklahoma said, quote, "The Ten Commandments is one of the foundations of our nation." On June the 27th, 2024, the Oklahoma Superintendent of Schools ordered that all school districts in his state, quote, "teach the Bible." In explaining his decision, he said, quote, "The Bible is one of the most historically significant books and a cornerstone of Western civilization, along with the Ten Commandments." Christian nationalism is not only on the rise in places such as Oklahoma and Louisiana. Micah Beckwith, an avowed Christian nationalist, is a Republican candidate for Indiana Lieutenant Governor. And according to a recent survey, 40% of all Hoosier adults support the ideas underlying Christian nationalism, such as the United States is a Christian nation and turning away from God is at the heart of the country's problems. So with those recent facts in mind, let's get on with the discussion. So first I'm going to ask Beau, who's written a book on this topic. Beau, exactly what is Christian nationalism?
Well, thanks, and I appreciate you all being here. I think back to my Eureka College days. I remember one of my professors being involved with the Peoria Council on Global Affairs in Illinois, and how I was so impressed by the conversations they were having. So now to be sitting here helping to lead one is just a real honor. And yeah, when we're talking about Christian nationalism, I'll give kind of our academic definition, and I'll give a more colloquial understanding of it. So, two of the leading scholars, one of them based here in Indianapolis, Andrew Whitehead, and then Samuel Perry, talk about Christian nationalism as an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture. And that's really succinct and helpful, but just put in more colloquial terms, we're talking about those who believe that being a good American and being a good Christian go together. And of course, they have a particular understanding of what it means to be a good Christian and what it means to be a good American. And it's often an ideology that's used to uphold a particular social order that privileges certain people and diminishes others. And it's rooted in this myth that the country was founded as a Christian nation, right? So in order to justify this ideology, justify this worldview, they want to root it in this idea that America was founded as a Christian nation. There's lots of problems with that understanding. We can get into that some tonight, but when we're talking about Christian nationalism, that's the ideology that we're talking about.
Sheila, some people have said we should call this white Christian nationalism. Do you have any views about that?
I have views about everything, obviously, but yeah, the way in which this movement has morphed, as you will, Beau is exactly right. What it does is say, if you are the right kind of Christian, and implicit in that, in the way that it is being, it has been used politically, is a white male straight Christian. Those are the people who, according to this ideology, are supposed to be in charge of this country. And it does contain an enormous amount of racism, not an insignificant amount of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and certainly paternalism. I mean, this is there's a great deal of misogyny involved. The ultimate goal is to place certain people in charge of the country and to support this mythology that those were the people who began the country and were intended to continue to run it.
So Sheila, as Beau said, a premise of Christian nationalists in the United States is that the country was founded as a Christian country. Is that true?
Not even close. In fact, interestingly, America has always been a very diverse place. Initially, in the early days, diverse meant different kinds of Protestants, and it has continued to expand since then. But the founders of this country were determined to keep religion and the state separate. And we have tons of documentation from all of the founders. In fact, we even know that when the First Amendment was being argued about, the first suggestion was there shall be no national church. But that was voted down by the founders because they wanted language that made it clear that, as James Madison put it, the church and the state have very different jurisdictions. And of course, as Thomas Jefferson later explained to the Danbury Baptists, the language of the First Amendment was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. And Don, as you have pointed out in some of your presentations, Article 6 of the Constitution explicitly says there shall be no religious test for public office. So we have an enormous amount of data, which is not at all subject to argument by credible historians or legal scholars, that show that the intent was always to have government be neutral as to questions of religious belief.
So Sheila, as you saw me at the earlier part of this conversation, 2 states at least have now said that the 10 Commandments needs to be displayed because it's the foundation of American law. What do you think about that idea?
I think it's stupid. Actually, and as you have pointed out and others have pointed out, there are multiple versions of the 10 Commandments. And in both of those states, they have, I think, used the Cecil B. DeMille's version. But there, if you look at the Cecil B. DeMille's version, the first 5 commandments are all religious. Thou shalt have no other God before me. Well, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. These are not governmental. And as far as the laws against against theft, against murder, against perjury, those were laws that far preceded the Moses and the Ten Commandments. They were regular features of law of life in societies that far preceded the society that that was portrayed in the Cecil B. DeMille's version of the Ten Commandments.
You are in fact correct about what they're supposed to display. The versions that are in the various Bibles are too long, so they shorten it based on the versions in the book, the movie, The Ten Commandments. So, Beau, first of all, we've talked a little bit about Andrew Whitehead. He's written a book called American Idolatry. First of all, who is Andrew Whitehead?
Yeah, and before I do that, I just want to say that I think the way you solve the Ten Commandment problem is you just have all these schools post them in the Hebrew, right? Because that's the one they originally written.
Or Aramaic. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, and so Andrew Whitehead is a really incredible human being who's right here in Indianapolis. He's a sociologist at IU and one of the 3 or 4 leading scholars on the study of Christian nationalism in the United States. So just a great resource that we have right here in our own community.
So he wrote a book called American Idolatry, and he argues that that Christian nationalism is a threat to the Christian church. You're part of the Christian church. Do you agree with that? And if you do, why?
Yeah, and I don't presume that everybody on this call certainly is coming from a confessionally Christian perspective, but given what Christian nationalism claims to be, I think it's important for Christians to interrogate what this ideology is about and how it perhaps compromises, or not perhaps, but how it does compromise the sort of traditional witness of Christian churches, right? In our tradition, right, there's nothing that goes higher than God. And what Christian nationalism does is it puts the critique of the country out of bounds. So I always remember that, after September 11th and some of the critiques of the Iraq War, in my hometown where I grew up in rural Illinois, there was a billboard that said, "America, love it or leave it," right? And that said a very powerful statement. You can either love America without critique, or to critique it was to basically make you not a good American. And that makes the country into something that it isn't. It makes the country into a god. It makes the country into an idol. No country is perfect. No human being is perfect. And a country is simply a way that a bunch of human beings have decided how they live together. And so from a Christian perspective, that it's dangerous to make something into an idol that is a human construction. There's literally all these prohibitions throughout the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures saying don't do that, including in the Ten Commandments. And so I do think it's a very dangerous thing when it comes to the Christian confession, because of that idolatry, and also because it makes everybody it violates that confession, that idea that all of us are created in the image of God and all of us enjoy equal status before God.
He also argues that this whole idea of Christian nationalism is driving people away from even other churches, that they think this defines Christianity and don't want to have any part of that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the things about Christian nationalism that Christians don't talk about enough, right? Which we're living in a time where what it means to be Christian is rapidly changing. The participation in organized religion is rapidly changing. And my job as a pastor is to organize a Christian community, and a community that teaches the faith and helps people live their faith out. And there's a lot of cultural baggage that people have to unpack before they're willing to walk through a church door. And Christian nationalism only adds to that cultural baggage. There's a lot of people that says, if to be a Christian is to be that, I don't want to be that. And so it's a really difficult thing that it's ironic, right? That those who claim that they're making the country into a more Christian country, or recovering some nostalgic past that was Christian in some weird, strange way, that they're actually making it harder for Christians today to build the kind of Christian communities that we think we're called to build. So it's very pernicious.
So I was actually making a presentation on Sunday, and a young man came up to me afterwards and he said, I go to Heron School, and when I tell people I go to church, they say, why would a nice person like you, who's not a racist or bigot, even go to church? And I think that's a commentary on sort of where some of this idea is coming from. We're losing our young people because they think Christianity is being defined by the loudest voices among us. Your book, Beau, which we've already talked about, starts off, I think the subtitle is How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. First of all, for our guests, what exactly is a mainline Protestant?
Well, how much time do we have tonight? So if we think of American Christianity in the broadest of strokes, right, you kind of have a third that's American Catholics, a third that's American evangelicals, and a third that's American mainliners. Now, there's a lot of other niche traditions, the Anabaptists, the Orthodox that are in there too, but just think of it broadly in those three categories. The mainliners have historically been your more ecumenically minded Christians. They're the ones who might be willing to work with other traditions on social witness. They're the ones who have been traditionally more open to the findings of modern science, the historical critical study of the Bible. The best way I just know, like, they really are they tend to be more open to the world than the history of American evangelicalism has been. And so the mainliners often are presented as your moderate to progressive Christians, and there's some truth to that, but it's really about a mindset and or a sense of belonging. We often measure them by the denominational affiliation. So there's these 7 sisters of the mainline. I'm not going to list them all, but there's 7 different denominations: your Episcopalians, your Methodists, your UCC that they belong to. So you can think about them in terms of how they belong, or you can think about them in terms of how they believe. But that's a good way to think about the mainliners is from those two perspectives.
So in your book, you say that the mainline Protestants have contributed to Christian nationalism. What's the basis for that claim, which is actually the subtitle of your book?
Yeah, so the reason my co-author and I wrote this book is we've been writing about Christian nationalism for a long time on our Substack called A Public Witness, which covers religion and politics. And we were noticing that everybody was blaming the evangelicals, and everybody was blaming the sort of more extreme Christians for the problem of Christian nationalism. And while I think there's a lot of blame to go around, and that's deserved, I also think it's a little bit of a letting us off the hook and saying, well, that's their problem, not our problem, or that's them and not us. And that's dangerous, right, when we other people. And the funny thing is when you hear and listen to some of these Christian nationalists today, when you listen to the David Bartons of the world, who's this sort of evangelical pseudo-historian that really pushes this myth of America as a Christian nation, a lot of the evidence he points to are things that mainline Protestants did. So he'll talk about, well, it's right there in our Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. It's right there in the national motto, in God we trust. And these things are all things that the mainline church helped create. The things that the mainline church pushed for, whether it's members, it's pastors, it's political leaders. So it's really a history that needs to be told, because it's kind of laid the ground in the soil in which the sort of contemporary expressions of Christian nationalism have grown. So there's a whole history there of the more moderate to progressive Christians who I think unwittingly, inadvertently, but still did a lot that led to this current moment that we're in, and we need to reckon with that.
Was one nation under God in our Pledge of Allegiance from the very beginning?
No, it wasn't. And ironically, the original Pledge of Allegiance was written by a Baptist pastor who intentionally left it out. And it was only added in after a sermon by a Presbyterian USA pastor in Washington, D.C. in 1954, where he knew that he would have then President Dwight Eisenhower captive in the audience. And he decided to advocate for it and push for it, and the media covered it, and then Congress ran with it, and the president signed it, and a few weeks later. It's one of the most effective sermons I've ever seen. I wish my own parishioners listened to me that closely.
So Sheila, turning to you now, some people argue that Christian nationalism is actually a threat to our democracy. Do you agree with that? Is that an overstatement, or in what way is it a threat?
It is not an overstatement. The biggest problem, I am one of my hot button issues is the fact that we have low levels of civic literacy in the United States, and too many Americans do not understand the underlying philosophy of the American Constitution. What really made America extraordinary was we were the first country to base civic participation on one's behavior rather than one's identity. And granted, at that time, it was white guys who owned property, but it was still a huge difference from the countries from which our original founders came, all of which placed great importance on your status, on your identity. Here, any white guy could be a citizen, an equal citizen, so long as he obeyed the rules. The whole idea that made America really exceptional was this notion that good behavior, rather than one's identity, whether that was as we have improved over the years, whether our identity is Christian or Jewish or Islamic, whether we're white or black, whether we are gay or straight, none of those things matter in terms of our participation in a democratic polity. What matters is our behavior and how we act. And Christian nationalism is really a dagger at the heart of that particular premise. And that premise underlies our entire legal system, as you know.
So there's recently been a study that shows that there's a strong correlation between Christian nationalism and support for an authoritarian government. Does that surprise you, Sheila?
Not at all. If you know, as Beau has just pointed out, the idea is that you are beholden to God, or in this case, the nation, and that questioning or criticizing is tantamount to treachery. So the authoritarianism that is at the heart of Christian nationalism is very consistent with, I hesitate to call it a philosophy, because I think basically it's fear and hate. And I'm not sure that that constitutes a philosophy, but certainly to the extent that there is an overarching philosophy, authoritarianism fits very nicely in that context.
So, Beau, in that connection, I saw a presentation you gave, and I think you opened the slide from January the 6th. To what extent do you think Christian nationalism played into the January 6th riot at the United States Capitol building?
I think this is one of those topics that we think we understand, and we actually don't understand it nearly as well as we think we do. It was very obvious that day that there were Christian symbols, banners, Bible citations, the quote-unquote Christian flag present in the crowd and among the insurrectionists. But I don't think we really fully get why they were there and what they were doing. And I think the most important book you can read on Christian nationalism is called Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Built Christian Nationalism. But after you get done reading my book, I think that the second most important book that's coming out right now is a book by a scholar named Matthew Taylor called The Violent Take It by Force. And Taylor is covering this to a T. He really tries to answer this question of how did religion inform the January 6th insurrection. And he really calls attention to an understudied and misunderstood part of American Christianity, the independent charismatic movement. This is the Paula White Cains of the world, the Lance Wallnaus of the world. They've gotten some more attention recently here because they keep showing up on the campaign trail. But it's really a group of people that not that long ago, I'm talking the last few years, were considered to be very fringe, even within American Christianity and American evangelicalism. And they are kind of redefining American evangelicalism in their own image. And there's not a lot of accountability. There's a real militancy to the movement. It's a really I'll just use the word, it's a really scary way of understanding Christianity. And I think that it's something that is increasing in prominence in our politics and in our society. And I think Matthew Taylor does the best job of explaining this. So I think it's there. I think it's complicated. I don't think we understand it well. But the answer is, I think that there's a lot of religious people who thought they were engaging in kind of a spiritual warfare for the soul of the nation. And I don't use those words lightly. And I think Matthew Taylor does a great job documenting all that in his book, The Violent Take It by Force.
Beau, have you heard of something called the Seven Mountain Mandate?
Yes, that's part of all of this. Yes.
So tell us about what that's all about.
Oh, Don, now you're asking me to wade into things I don't know nearly as much about as I should. So the Seven Mountain Mandate is, again, comes out of this independent charismatic tradition. When I say independent, I mean they're not part of any denomination. When I say charismatic, they're a group of Christians that believe in the sort of outpouring of the Holy Spirit as seen through sort of spiritual gifts, speaking in tongues, prophecy, etc. And part of this group thinks that there are sort of 7 mountains or 7 spheres of influence within our culture: politics, media, education, etc. And that all Christians that should only be led by Christians, and that they're, and again, a particular type of Christian, and that the Christians need to seek influence in those areas. They need to take control of them and basically control the culture for God. It's a very it's a very, again, scary, because it's a dominant understanding. It's Christians should seize controls, and by perhaps any means necessary, and they should use it to sort of enforce the will of God on society. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the 7 mountain mandate.
And that's presumably what you're also talking about when you talk about the charismatics being involved in the January 6th riots at the Capitol building. Correct.
I think it's an expression of that. And to be very clear, I'm not saying that all charismatics believe in this. I'm saying that there's a subset of charismatics that believe in this, and that subset is gaining in prominence.
So Sheila, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but just to make sure we understand this, most people who advocate Christian nationalism say that the idea of separating church and state is an invention of the liberals on the Supreme Court in the 60s and 70s, and that the real idea of the First Amendment was to prevent the establishment of the national church. I think to some extent that's already been talked about, but what can you say to people who say that the idea of separating church and state is a modern invention?
Well, they are wrong, and most all credible historians and legal scholars can point to a number of documents that come to us from the founders that express the desire. First of all, you have to remember that they had come out of a time when religious warfare was common in Europe, and they were trying to avoid that. But the entire desire was to respect the different jurisdictions, really, of the church and the state, and to protect what I would really call the integrity of the individual conscience. If you look at the First Amendment, the First Amendment's got 2 religion clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, and read together, that's a prescription for keeping government's hands off the church and respecting the right of individuals to determine what they believed, who they prayed to, or if they prayed. It was part of the Bill of Rights that, read as an organic whole, really respects individual liberty in a way that is entirely inconsistent with the expression of Christian nationalism. Hello?
Did we lose Don?
Did Don disappear?
Oh, Don, you're on mute there, Don. You're on mute.
There he is.
I'm back.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I dropped out. Are you done? Sheila, were you done? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm done.
So about your book, and this may be something that's going to take a while to sort of parse through. You say, quote, over and over, social scientists have found a troubling association between strong expressions of Christian nationalism and a variety of retrograde viewpoints. First of all, I suppose you need to define retrograde and then talk about what are some examples of that.
Yeah, and I think that it's helpful here to talk about how we study Christian nationalism. There's a myth that circulates that Christian nationalism is a term invented by one group to make another group look bad. And in reality, Christian nationalism is a ideology that we study in social science using a scale that's generated through data and through survey research. So Andrew Whitehead and others have gone out there and pulled representative samples of the American people. They've asked them a battery of questions like, do you believe America was founded as a Christian nation? Do you believe there should be prayer in public schools? And based upon people's response to these questions, they've generated a scale that ranges, let's just say, from 0 to 20, with 20 being the most fervent and 0 being not at all. And they place groups of people on that scale. And so we have some solid statistical evidence of this reality that Christian nationalism exists and is operative within our society. And then the question becomes, what is it linked with, right? So we can take that data and we can see how it correlates, how it moves with other beliefs and other data in positive or negative directions. So we know that Christian nationalism, and the more strongly people support Christian nationalist ideas, the less likely they are, for example, to support interracial marriage. The more likely they are to support limited voting rights. The less likely they are to support the rights of LGBTQ people. So we can see a bunch of correlations in the data that says, if you believe this, you're more likely to believe these other things as well. And those other things are, I use the term retrograde. I would call it an old-fashioned, a way of understanding society that we have left behind us when it comes to things like interracial marriage, rights, civil rights for all people, that is troubling, right? Because it seems like this movement under the banner of "Yay America" and "We're Christian" is actually trying to undermine this democratic progress that we've created as we've lived more and more into our founding ideals.
So you also say the racism in Christian nationalism today is important to recognize. That's a pretty strong conclusion about a group of people. What's the basis for that?
Well, I'll give two answers here. There is, again, this social science research that shows these correlations between particular racial views or attitudes towards topics like interracial marriage and Christian nationalism. But there's also, I think, just this fundamental problem with the story that Christian nationalists tell, right? If you believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, well, we know that when America was founded, there was the, genocide of indigenous people, right? We know that there was the enslavement of African Americans. So if that's what a Christian nation looks like, it's a very racialized understanding of a Christian nation. It's a Christian nation that is okay with the enslavement of other groups of people. It's a nation that's a Christian nation that's okay with the mass killing of others. As a pastor, it just doesn't sound very Christian to me. And so I'm troubled by this idea that if this is the myth that's operative here, we really need to interrogate that myth and understand its implications if we want to cling to it. And I actually think this is one of the more effective arguments against Christian nationalism. What does Christian nationalism mean? Well, it means America was founded as a Christian nation. America is a Christian nation. Was it founded that way? Oh, yes, it was. Well, how do you explain this? How do you explain the enslavement of African Americans? And then people go, oh, well, yeah, I guess that wasn't very Christian. Well, then maybe it wasn't a Christian nation, right? You can kind of see how you can poke holes in the logic and create a wider conversation that leads people to maybe become a little more suspicious of something that they thought was obviously true.
So Sheila, do you have any views on that? Racism is part of this movement or part of this ideology?
Actually, yes. When I look at the sociology and especially some of the studies that have been done by PPRI, which is, I believe, the Public Religion, PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, the abstraction of this particular ideology, which is really far more political than it is religious when you get right down to it, clearly has attracted people who feel that the society that they live in now isn't what they were promised. They were promised to be on top. These are disproportionately people who look around and see gay people getting married and women doing sports stuff and Black people not being subservient and who feel dispossessed by the society that they occupy. There is the people who disproportionately identify as Christian nationalists are those who the research tells us exhibit what they nicely call racial grievance, and which I would call bigotry. But you have to look at the sociological factors that lead somebody to find this particular form of religio political belief appealing. And it has clearly appealed to people who have racial grievance.
Beau, does that help explain a connection between white nationalist views and support for more firearm freedoms?
Again, now you're getting pretty far afield from what I know, but I would just say that I do think that there is this sense of loss that Sheila's talking about that animates some of this, and with that sense of loss comes a sense of fear. And so I think there's a logic to this argument that you know, wanting to protect an understanding of gun rights is motivated by that sense of fear as well. So I can see the logic. I can't sit here and tell you that is actually there in terms of what the data tells us.
Okay, all right. So Sheila, I think it's probably fair to say that you are not a Christian from birth, right? Is that fair?
That's correct. Nor am I now. No.
So how does Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism affect or potentially affect people who aren't Christians?
I think, and I think Beau has touched on this. I think, first of all, it's scary for those of us. I'm Jewish. It's scary for my Muslim friends. It's scary for my atheist friends. But I think it also is scary for real Christians, because it's really not. When I was growing up in Anderson, Indiana, as a little Jewish kid, and there were I think 30 Jewish families in Anderson, my mother used to say, honey, a real Christian is a Jew's best friend. It's too bad there aren't that many real Christians. The problem with Christian nationalism is, in my view, it is not Christianity. It is a hatefulness that is trying to turn a term that ought to be respected into something that isn't very respectable at all. And it is clearly politically a movement that wants to make certain people, and not all Christians by any means, dominant in a society. And frankly, it's not good for any woman. It's not good for any African American. It's certainly not good for any gay person. And I don't think it's good for real Christians.
What do you think about that, Beau? I mean, that probably is consistent with your views in your book. It's not really good for real Christians, or at least Christians.
Yeah,
You don't.
as we talked earlier, I really feel like it's very corrupting of what the Christian life and Christian communities are supposed to be all about.
You want to elaborate on that?
No, not beyond. I think what I just said earlier. I think that, you know, I like the idea of a good Christian is a Jew's best friend. Is like this idea of love. You know, Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, and he says, love God and love your neighbor, right? Give God everything you got. And because you're giving God everything you got, love your neighbor as yourself. And it's really hard to square the tenets and the ideas of Christian nationalism with the idea that you're loving your neighbor. It defines neighbor way more narrowly than Jesus does.
All right. So I think you've laid out the problems, both of you, and I thank you for that. There are people on this call, I'm supposing, agree with that, with your views. Sheila, what can people who are listening to this call do about this?
Well, we can stop electing them.
Anything else we can do?
Well, I think, again, this is my hot button issue. I believe that we need long-term to really beef up civic education, so that when I was teaching, I taught for 20 years at IUPY, now IU Indy. I got students who, if they did have a government class, either didn't listen or the teacher didn't teach it very well. We need to reinvigorate the teaching of government and accurate history in our schools. If kids come out of that experience with a genuine knowledge, there is, by the way, a curriculum that is wonderful called We the People. Unfortunately, it's voluntary if a government teacher wants to use it. But kids who take that particular curriculum are steeped in the knowledge of the way in which America's founders developed our Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They are taught accurate history, and they come out really impervious to these kinds of twisted logic arguments about the founding of the country. So long term, we really, really need to turn our attention to civic education.
Well, I know this because you spoke at my church. You've been out speaking to churches. What can people in churches do? What can other people do to combat this Christian nationalism if they agree that it's a problem? What should they be doing in addition? Obviously,
Yeah.
you're doing. Why are you doing what you're doing?
Yeah, first, I just wholeheartedly endorse what Sheila said about civics education. Not only is it, I think, useful from the historical standpoint, but we also need to remind people what democracy is all about. Like everybody getting an equal say and equal vote, the legitimacy of opposition and disagreement. We really, we've lost something here in the last few years, and that's just quite shocking to me. And I don't think a lot of us saw it coming in that sense of the democratic backsliding, and I think we need to be working vigorously to correct it. From a Christian standpoint, I think two things, right? I think this is a white Christian problem, and I think that puts an extra burden on white Christians, you could argue white Christian men, to do something about it, to say something about it, right? Because there's so many white Christian men who are espousing this, driving this, promoting this, and they're saying we're the true Christians, we're the real Americans, we're the ones who should have power because of those identities. That if they have people who share those same identities who are standing up in opposition and saying, actually, I'm a Christian and I don't think this is Christianity at all, and I'm proud to be an American, and that's not at all what I think patriotism is about. I'm a man, and I don't think men are inherently entitled to be the ones in power. I think that those are the kind of things that we need to be saying, because if the only voices in opposition are those who aren't those people, they don't get heard as much within this conversation amongst the white Christian men. So I think white Christian men have a particular responsibility to speak out within these contexts and conversations to make clear that to really sort of contest what it means to be Christian, what it means to be a good American, what it means to what male leadership can look like in our country. Because what's getting a lot of the attention is really scary.
So, Beau, I know you've been out talking to churches. What kind of reaction are you getting from the people that you're talking to?
Well, I do a lot of preaching to the choir, unfortunately, and so I get a lot of, again, a lot of mainline churches who my message to them is we need to interrogate ourselves. We need to understand our own complicity in the story and offer our own confession and repentance to that. So I'm getting a lot of surprise when people realize, oh, wow, we were actually way more part of this problem. They were really eager to denounce it in everybody else, to get on Facebook and rant and rave about how awful Christian nationalism is. And then all of a sudden they have to look in the mirror, and that becomes a little more difficult. So I think that's been it's been a surprise to people, but hopefully a healthy way to get at the problem, because it gives them more that they can do about it, right? If all of a sudden it's a problem that they've contributed to, not just a problem in somebody else, that they can start working on the ways they've contributed to it and perhaps get better at it. And again, I think we know how to do this, right? A lot of churches have done this when it comes to the sins of racism, sexism, etc. We've interrogated our own history, interrogated our current practices, and made a commitment to do better in how we talk, how we act, and even how we spend things like spending our money. So I feel like we can do a better job on Christian nationalism if we're willing to first look in the mirror and not see it just as a problem that somebody else has, but also a problem that we need to reckon with in terms of our own contributions to it.
So people I've talked to say, when I was growing up, we used to sing 100 Christian soldiers in our churches. Perhaps we shouldn't be singing those songs anymore.
It's a beautiful tune and some terrible lyrics. So yes, I think that's absolutely right. There's a lot of stuff like that, right? There's a lot of stuff that we once thought, well, oh gee, this is no problem at all. The example I often use is Boy Scout Sunday, right? A lot of churches do Boy Scout Sunday where the Scouts present the flags and the Pledge of Allegiance and Christian worship services. And everybody thinks, well, this is just Americana and the church and patriotism go together, no problem. It's actually really awful theology, and it's a really dangerous practice if we would only stop and think about what's actually going on there. And so it's again, I love the Boy Scouts. I'm all for scouting, but I think we need to be careful with how we mix these things. And we need to be a little bit more intentional and interrogate some of these practices that we thought were just fine, that in reality are quite difficult. And part of that is, right, we've become more pluralistic as a country. We've become more religiously diverse, more racially and ethnically diverse. And we're coming to realize that the homogeneity that existed in the past, a lot of this stuff slid by. It's not that there weren't people who were hurt by it. They were just fewer in number and not seen and not as visible. But now that they're more visible and we're hearing from them, we ought to pay attention to how bad some of this stuff is, because we're a democracy. And if everybody doesn't have an equal say and an equal vote and equal voice in the public square, we're not living up to our democratic principles. It's just that simple.
So Sheila, you want to respond? You have anything to add to that before we go to questions?
I thought that was beautiful, and I have nothing to add to it.
Great. So I want to talk about a couple of things, then we'll get some questions. Some people say from time to time, how do I confront the people that have these views that the United States was a Christian nation? One thing you can say is, well, you can go read the Constitution, which founds our government, and see if you can find the word God in there. And they will say it must be there somewhere. Surely it's in the oath that the president takes, so help me God. And you read the Constitution, you'll see that is not there. The so help me God was added later. So the word God does not appear in the Constitution at all. People noted that during the debates over its ratification, and they said, well, we left it out. This country is not founded under Christian principles. But if you really want to prove that, and I'm just going to bring up a slide for a minute, you can actually prove this. Everybody see that?
There you go.
Yep, it's up there, Don.
All right, so John Adams, I'm sure everybody knows, especially those who have thought about this, was the second president of the United States. He was involved in helping draft with Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin the Declaration of Independence. He was very active in promoting the Constitution, and then was the second president, first vice president under Washington. And he found the United States engaged in some battles with the Barbary pirates, and entered into a treaty with Tripoli that was presented to the Senate and ratified to the Senate. And it says at the very beginning, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Well, there it is. I mean, anybody says anything to the contrary, all you have to do is say, here it is, Article 11 of this treaty, which is the law of the land today. It's never been abrogated, never been contradicted. There it is, people. So for those of you who think it's hard to confront people who have these views, all you have to do is say, okay, here's this document. Now what do you have to say? And that's what I just want to say to people. If you're going to confront this, you need some facts, but you don't need very many facts. And so I'm going to at this point stop my sharing and turn this over to Ray, who will ask or solicit and get questions from the audience to ask to the panel members. So thank you all panel members.
Okay, thank you very much, Don, and Sheila and Beau, I appreciate it very much. So we'll now open it up to questions from our audience. I have a couple already, but since I have the mic right now, I'll ask. First question for me is, how are these state movements to fund private schools connected to this Christian nationalism movement?
A lot.
Sheila, I know you have an answer to that.
I know that initially when people started supporting the idea of vouchers, many good people said, okay, we're going to encourage competition and we're going to get poor children out of schools that are not doing what they should. What we have seen over the years is, first of all, let's just take Indiana. In Indiana, over 90% of the money that goes to school vouchers, which is has grown enormously, by the way, goes to religious schools, a significant number of which are very, I hesitate to use the word conservative because that's really not fair to conservative Christianity, but they go to religious schools. And as, believe it or not, the Star, which is not my favorite publication these days, but they did a very good expose recently showing that most of the money for those private religious schools is going to parents who have who are in the upper income brackets. So we're not helping poor children, but what we are doing is eroding support for the public schools that were founded to be what one political scientist calls constitutive of a public. They are the schools that put children who are very different together and teach them about the country and teach them about citizenship, ideally. Now, a colleague and I did a study before I retired to see whether some of these, or any of these religious schools were teaching civics. And first of all, Indiana gives money to the voucher schools with really no strings attached. They don't require them to teach civics or anything. And most of them don't. And a great many of them teach creationism rather than science, and a very whitewashed history. So that the siphoning off of public funds to support what are essentially religious schools, in my view, has been extremely detrimental to the constitution of a polity that understands what citizenship requires and how this government is supposed to function. It's very scary, to use a term that Beau used properly earlier.
And
Sheila, I think one implication of the question might be, is Christian nationalism in some way tied up with this?
I don't know. I mean, I certainly have not studied that or seen studies that would explicitly tie Christian nationalism to voucher schools. However, if you take a look at the states, including Indiana, where vouchers have been most supported and the legislatures have been most anxious to do that, you see a great deal of overlap between Christian nationalist philosophy and the ways in which these voucher programs are developed and you know.
But I come at this just from a slightly different angle, but I think a complementary one, which is we are seeing, I think, the way that Christian nationalism as an ideology is starting to infect education policy when it comes to public schools in certain states. So, the push to teach the Bible in Oklahoma and similar bills in Louisiana and other places. And I think we really need to interrogate what's going on here. If you haven't paid attention to this, and Google it, right now, the state of Oklahoma has a request for a proposal to spend $3 million up to $6 million on purchasing Bibles for every public school district in the state in order to be taught in public school classrooms. And I think when we see there not only the idea of Christian nationalism, but I think we also see this push by certain Christians to turn the state into the church, because they see their churches declining, right? I think that the idea is, well, if we can't reach the kids in churches, we'll reach them in schools to make them good Christians so they will come back to church. And of course, I don't think this will work at all, right? I think anytime you coerce people into religious belief, it's not real belief and it only alienates people. And it also puts the state in a terrible situation, right? Which version of the Bible do you buy? What happens when the Catholic teacher is asked a question about baptism by the Protestant kid, right? I mean, it sounds so nice and easy. Well, we should make America more of a Christian nation. It's a great talking point for a certain constituency, but the devil's in the details, as they say, right? And the details here are really, really quite devilish. I think constitutionally it's hugely problematic, but even if you wanted to support it, how you actually implement this policy is almost impossible. And I think this is a classic example where we have a lot of symbolism, but we aren't thinking about the substance, and the substance is hugely problematic.
All right, thank you. Denise Franklin actually has a question. Denise?
Yeah, for the speakers, I'd like your thoughts on the role that Paul Weyrich has played in the current state of the intersection between religion and government, and how he essentially hijacked the American church for the sake of political power.
Well, me first?
Yes.
Okay. My understanding from reading the history of that, when Roe v. Wade was first handed down, most conservative Christian churches were fine with it. About 6 years later, Wyrick and a group of pastors who were very upset with the federal government's refusal to allow tax deductions for segregated schools wanted to start a movement, and they realized, segregation now and segregation forever probably wasn't the most appealing political maxim to go on. So they decided to turn their to create a political movement around the abortion issue. And that is where the pro-choice or pro-life movement began, with Wyrick and his ability to get at that, I believe, evangelical churches behind that. But the goal was they were very upset with Jimmy Carter because it was the Carter administration that had refused to allow the tax deduction for contributions to these segregation academies. But he has been and I don't even know if he's still alive. I haven't.
He passed away in 2008.
I'm not sad. I'm sorry. That was terrible. That was very not Christian. I'm sorry. But he was fundamental, no pun intended, in the creation of first the Christian Coalition and later iterations of that movement.
Yeah, and I think Wyrick is definitely certainly a historic figure in the development of the religious right, as Sheila has mentioned. But I also think it's important to name how much this movement has evolved in the last few years, right? So when you see the Russell Moores of the world, right, a very conservative evangelical and theologically and politically, essentially get run out of the Southern Baptist Convention and American evangelicalism because he wasn't Trumpian enough. I don't know that Paul Wyrick would be the leader of the religious right today, because I'm not sure he would be perceived as a leader in that thing. Again, I think that there is this movement towards the Paula White Cains of the world, the Lance Wallnows of the world. I think we're seeing a different cast of characters who are even less institutionalist, who are less interested in working within the system for their ends, as opposed to just blowing the system up. I really think we're in some sense evolving into more of a kind of religious anarchy within our politics, you might say. And it's a really scary place to be, because while I don't agree with Wyrick at all, I at least knew that he was trying to sort of operate within the system, even if he was also trying to adjust the system slightly. He wasn't trying to completely tear the system down. And I think we're in a position where a lot of people today are just trying to tear the system down.
Well, when you sow to the wind, you reap the whirlwind.
Right.
Yes, I think that's helpful. I think there is a connection. You can certainly draw a line between there and now. And Russell Moore is part of this, right? Russell Moore led part of the purge of the Southern Baptist Convention to make it more of a conservative, theologically conservative, politically conservative denomination. And there's some irony in the fact that he was then pushed out of it, right, for the reasons you're talking about, Denise.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Jim, all I have is Jim's iPhone. So Jim, you're up next here. And by the way, Don, if you have something to add to one of these comments, please feel free to
I will.
do so as well.
Yeah, I will. Thanks. Right.
You out there, Jim? Maybe not. All right. How about Bruce R? Where's Bruce? That's it. We're losing our books here. Well, actually, Jim was actually asking about the titles of your books that you mentioned. If we could maybe get a list of those after we're done here, if the panelist would maybe send me an email with those lists, I can provide them to our participants later. Okay, Bruce, are you out there? I can read his question though. He said, I'm interested in comments about how the conservative ultra-right Roman Catholic movements factor into this? He's thinking of J.D. Vance and SCOTUS.
Yeah, I'm going to throw my hands up here too. I'm very cautious here and not saying more than I know. There's been a lot of good journalism on this lately. I haven't dived deep into it to know. Again, there has always been a more conservative church within the Catholic Church. Obviously, the current Pope is also pushing back against some of those movements, and so I think it's very complicated. I think there's been some recently good journalism on it. I'm trying to remember what outlet I saw just wrote this piece, but if you do a little Googling, you'll find some very recent articles that I think can speak to that much more authoritatively than I can. And I see Sheila nodding her head as well.
Yeah,
So Sheila, I heard in the question something about SCOTUS, which I suppose people are talking about the justices on the Supreme Court who were Catholic. Do you have any thoughts on that as to how that relates to what's happening?
you know, this court, Don, as you well know, is, in my view, a rogue court. What, to the extent that their religious beliefs factor into that, I am absolutely unable to say. I don't think, for example, that Clarence Thomas is focused on anything religious, just financial. Somebody called him Clarence Thomas, and I think that may be correct. I look at someone like Samuel Alito, who is not Catholic, I believe. Is that correct? I don't even know. But I mean, he's just an ideologue and was willing to really misstate the Dobbs decision. Whether you agree with his ultimate conclusion or not, was a profoundly dishonest view of both the law, the jurisdiction that preceded him, and the history that he cited. So, I have huge issues with this court, but to the extent that Catholicism enters into it, I am absolutely unable to comment. I just don't know.
Okay, well, thank you. It's one area maybe we need to do some digging on. I think Mr. Millard is next. Ken, is that your first name? Not sure. Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
There you go. Yeah, Kendall. Thank you, speakers. This has been very educational. Don, wanted to see if you could give us the site to that treaty. I didn't catch which treaty it was where President Adams said that this is not a Christian nation. I think that's a great site from early in our country's history that I think we could all use.
For those of you on the call, Kendall and I used to work together, so Kendall, good to see you on this call. I don't know the site for it, but it's the treaty between the United States and Tripoli. Ending the war with the Barbary pirates, and it was presented by John Adams, whose Secretary of State wrote it. He approved it, sent to the Senate ratified it, and it's still there. And it just seems to me that you just cite that one sentence and say, okay, case closed, because he was there.
What year was it? Do you remember what year it was?
I think it was 1897. I mean, 1787. I think so.
1787. Okay, thank you.
But you see, here's a guy that was one of the founding fathers. He was involved in the Declaration of Independence. He was involved in the discussions of the Constitution, the ratification, involved in the First Amendment, and then the vice president, and then the president. If he says the United States was not founded as a Christian nation, he's got to know something. You can't question that, it seems to me. So, but most people, I think, don't even know that treaty exists. I mean, apparently you're a well-educated guy and presumably didn't know it existed.
Okay. Actually, Jim responded. He's on his iPhone and he couldn't figure out how to unmute himself. So he's having a little technical problem, I guess. What comment he made that he'd like me to relate to you. It's vitally important to teach citizenship that has nothing to do with where you were born, but how you participate actively in society. And so that made me think about this movement towards birthright citizenship that we've heard mentioned a couple of times. How is that related to Christian nationalism?
Oh, the effort to get rid of birthright citizenship is, I think, very related to Christian nationalism. It is just another, I mean, what I have found really both appalling and very difficult to understand is the movement against immigration and immigrants and this constant demonization of immigration. And of course, the movement against birthright citizenship factors into that. It is again part of the racism that seems to animate this entire movement. Right?
And I think, Sheila, in addition to racism, as we know, you look around, the people that are coming in that are some people are most hostile against are the people who are not Christians. They're coming in from Asia, they're coming in from South Africa, that are not Christians, they're coming in as Muslims. And I think that's part of this, which is we're being replaced. You've heard that, the replacement theory. We're being diluted, we're being replaced. And that's part of this, which is if immigrants were all coming from Europe and they were already nominally Christians, I don't think we'd have that same backlash.
And if they were lovely people from Norway and very pale, you know, I tend to say, I have a son-in-law who is an immigrant, and he's been here 40 years now. He has never had a problem. He's from Great Britain and he's very pale, and nobody seems to be upset with him. You know, it's just a certain part of the immigration that we're getting that upsets these folks. You're quite correct.
I just say, I feel like this is actually a great way to understand how Christian nationalism works for the reasons you all are talking about. But let me just add this, right? I'm not a legal scholar. There's others on this call who are. But I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. And so by my reading of the Constitution, you know, if you were born in the United States, you are a citizen of this country. And so this ending birthright citizenship is really essentially trying to do a run around the Constitution and undermining of the Constitution by some people who would claim to be constitutionalists, who claim to extol the virtues of the Constitution. And when they start violating their own principles in that way, you have to ask what's at the heart of it, right? And what seems to be at the heart of this is that these immigrants don't fit their understanding of an ideal American in terms of race, ethnicity, country of origin, etc. And so they are quick to sort of say, well, that can't be legitimate because they're not true Americans. And then you start to say, well, what does true American mean here for them? And of course, it means white European, like Sheila's talking about. So I think this really makes quite clear how this ideology operates.
I agree with that.
All right, very good. Barbara Williams, you're next.
Thank you.
Barb?
Last night I heard a lecture by Drew Strait of the Anabaptist Seminary here in South Bend. And he made several points about what we can do to counter the Christian nationalism movement. He also talked a lot about what promotes the movement from the ideology to the action and then to the terrorism. And he specifically spoke about people who are most attracted, he had a lot of statistics, but people who are most attracted to the Christian nationalism ideology are often people who have sustained some type of hurt or trauma in their life. For example, PTSD, the issues of sexual molestation, either as a child or as an adult, the loss of a loved one, especially a recent loss of a loved one. And he also showed that the people who move from the ideology to the action and specifically to the terrorism usually takes 5 years. But what we're seeing now is that 5 years is being compressed. And the people who move most quickly are the people who believe in QAnon.
No.
The other thing he mentioned was that the epidemic of loneliness and isolation is promoting a lot of the Christian nationalism. That's what we're seeing in our mega churches here in South Bend. And that we can counteract that by creating more communities where people can participate without being exposed to that ideology. He also talked about the importance of showing facts when they spout some type of fake news or conspiracy theory or whatever, to try and counter it, and to do that from our religious organizations, the churches, the synagogues, and whatever, that we're not doing that enough to help those of us who are not Christian nationalists to be able to dialogue and counter, and that many churches, synagogues, and religious organizations shy away from anything that might be political, but now is the time for us to take some action to counteract what's happening in our country. So those are
Right.
points I just would like people to comment on.
If I
Thank
could
you very
say,
much.
if I could say a quick word to that, I've seen Drew's book. I haven't read it yet. It looks very interesting. I've heard people remark, I think this is true, they don't have any evidence to support it, right? That you used to have sort of extreme views in pockets and places, small towns, wherever, and people had a hard time, and they were, within their community said, well, that's extreme, that's not okay, that's not where we stand, and they were kind of, the norms held up, and they were kind of marginalized. And then social media and the internet comes along, and all those people, those extreme views can find each other, and all of a sudden they can connect. And instead of getting shunned and pushed back against and corrected, they're instead affirmed, encouraged, and even they feed off each other. So I think this phenomenon of how social media drives extremism is in terms of connecting people who otherwise wouldn't have found community is really, really interesting. And again, I keep using the word tonight, scary, but I think it's there.
I
All
agree.
right. Betty, you have a comment, question?
Yes, I'm going to remind people, don't forget, we have a nightcap session number 1. I was just taking some quick notes as you all were talking. Sheila had mentioned the vouchers. That is I work with the Tippecanoe County school superintendent on this issue. It's in the state of Indiana, the state legislative assembly has allowed up to $250,000 for a family of 4 to use school vouchers. And in the state of Indiana, the average income for a family of 4 is $90,000. So that far exceeds, and of course, goes way beyond the intention of the vouchers. And the cynic would suggest that this is an attempt to really weaken the public school systems. Here in Lafayette, we only have 2 private schools to go to. One is a Catholic and one is a evangelical Christian, and they have limits. So where would people go with their vouchers? I'm not sure where. And while you were talking about you probably heard in the news last night that in Oklahoma, that $3 million could easily be spent on the restrictions that applied to the Bible, which is the King James Version, that happens to have the documents, the American documents, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution in them, which there's only one Bible that currently has, because Bibles don't have these documents in them, but there is one that does, and that's Trump's Bible.
It costs
So-
$59. It costs $59.
The grip goes on. Well, they have $3 million to spend, and so Trump stands to make an awful lot of money. But I was going to ask the people attending, if you're wondering about this, this is not to suggest that your church has anything connected to this, but you might, next time you go to your church, see if there's not a flag in your sanctuary, an American flag. I can't remember growing up Catholic. I don't think the Catholic churches have ever had flags, but it has not been uncommon in the past. And maybe Beau, as a minister, you can comment on this, but it was not uncommon. I don't think people saw anything wrong with it, since the church and apple pie and all that. But to have a flag in your sanctuary today would more than underscore the lack of separation of church and state, and the thought on that. And just, but in your own churches, with those attending, the next time you go, see in your place of worship, then it doesn't have to be just a Christian place. Does your place where you go have a flag in the sanctuary? Beau, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, two quick things. One is to say that I did see the day that the Oklahoma has changed their requisition requirements for the Bibles, that now they don't have to have all the stuff and make only the Trump Bible eligible. It's still awful and terrible, but they are at least hearing some of the criticism. I'm still suspicious. But I will say that, yes, I mean, the flag coming of the sanctuary again was a mainline gift to the church, you might say, back back coming out of World War II and the Cold War era, where we were trying to push back and say we're not atheistic Russia, we're Christian America. And what's interesting is that even in a lot of evangelical churches today, there are, especially like the more mega church, in the warehouse type modern sanctuary, you won't see the flag at all, right? The conservative evangelicals don't have it, but the mainline Protestants still do in a lot of cases. So it's an interesting divide there. Somebody asked about the title of the book, Baptizing America. We have this story of how the flag got into the sanctuary. And we also have some tips on if you're really scared of like how to even start the conversation to get the flag out of the sanctuary. We have some tips on how you can do that without getting your pastor fired. Which again, I'm very supportive of pastors not getting fired.
I also want to say real quick, Ray, for the next person, that that we did have, for those of you who have been with us for a long time, you've heard the name Andrew Whitehead this evening. You might remember he was one of our two speakers in the January program, Andrew Whitehead with his book, as well as Rob Sayre with the Christian Theological Seminary. They got all of this rolling for us. And so, that's why we're particularly interested in having you join us this evening with Sheila and Don. And so.
Okay, thank you, Betty. Liz Moser, I'm sorry. You're up next. You out there, Liz? Yeah.
Yes, hi, good evening. I was just wondering, you brought up, someone brought up Russell Moore, and shameless plug, I attend St. Luke's United Methodist, and other than my pastor, Rob Freakway and Russell Moore, I don't hear a lot of people speaking out about this. I don't hear people sounding the alarm about this, and not on a national news platform. I attended a church in Louisiana years ago when the Charleston shooting happened, and it was a Baptist church, and he didn't mention it. I mean, the Sunday came and went, and he didn't even mention the Bible study shooting. And why do you suppose that the Christian nationalist religious people are so vocal, and people such as Reverend Beau on a national are not, when we need them?
I don't think that's quite fair. I get a lot of different newsletters and national newspapers, and they have been, it's been fairly recent, but there has been a fair amount of attention paid to this movement, and especially because we're in a political season, the real threat that it poses to democracy and to our basic constitutional philosophy. So I think everything takes time to sort of pierce the veil of well, gee, who's playing in that WNBA game, but I see more and more coverage of it in the national news. Beau, do you?
Are you getting invited? I know you get invited to some places because I see you. What's your experience with the people?
I mean, I'm still waiting for Stephen Colbert to call. So if any of you have a connection there, I'd appreciate it. I'll say that I think with Liz, if I can interpret a little bit of what I hear in your question, it's back to my whole a third, American Catholics, American evangelicals, American mainliners. The evangelicals tend to be the group of Christians that get the most media attention. I think this does go back to the rise of the religious right and just how influential that group has perceived to be in our politics. And again, mainliners, Catholics, they're a little more complicated, both religiously and politically, and they don't make for as sexy of a story. So I think that, when you see a lot of news articles, it tends to be, well, what are those evangelicals up to? Which I sometimes think we need some stories about what are those mainliners up to. I think my co-author wrote a piece recently about how the mainline Protestants were the dominant group in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and they might be the difference makers in the election. We should be paying attention to what they're doing instead of the evangelicals. And I think he's right. I do think some outlets have done a great job covering Christian nationalism. I think like NPR, for example, has done some really great reporting on this. I think there's good polling out there. Sheila mentioned PRI earlier. And I will say that there are a lot of American conservative evangelicals, Russell Moore, Patrick Miller. There's been a couple other books that have come out that are speaking out against this. My fear is that again, there's a lot of people that just aren't willing to listen to reason, in the sense of they just really like this idea that their political identity and their nationalistic identity and their religious identity can so easily go together and reinforce each other. And they just keep doing what they're doing. They keep lighting off fireworks and praying to the God who blesses America. And I think that's dangerous religiously and dangerous politically, but it makes people feel good and it's very easy to do. And I worry about that.
So for those of you who read the Indianapolis Star, and I know it's probably a smaller and smaller group, James Briggs has been writing a lot about this recently, especially in the context of Micah Beckwith, the candidate for Indiana lieutenant governor, who has said that if he ever got to the position of power, he ruled in the following C order: Christianity, Constitution, and conservatism. So James Briggs has been talking about that. So if you're interested in having a public perception of that, get the Star.
All right, thank you. It's about 8:26 now. We actually have time for one more question. Mary Lou Burton, you're out there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
The VA has a song. I worked for the VA for 30 some years, and as did my husband, who was a chaplain. And the VA has what they would call their song. And their song is God Bless America.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying.
Beau, I suppose you say, yes, that's true, right? We have all kinds.
Oh, it is true. I mean, I worked there 30 some years, and every time you had some kind of a congregational meeting, they would always come up with this God Bless America.
I'm going to add one thing to there, and that
song.
is that God bless America. God is not uniquely Christian. I think some people overlook that. For the Muslims, God is God. They simply use the name Allah. Jews have obviously the same God. They have a different view of it. So to associate anything that says God with Christianity is itself not entirely correct.
Okay.
So anyway, nice comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Is there one more question out there, Ray?
No, but it was actually a comment from Jim here. I kind of lost it. It was way back here. He had seen a T-shirt in the Southwest saying something about Native Americans fighting terrorism since 1632 or something or other. Anyhow, I thought it was kind of cute. Actually, I think we are out of questions at this point. Betty, you want to kind of say goodnight?
Yes, I will. I was actually looking for my friend Jean Bruce. Jean, may I ask you, I've been fascinated with your background. It's a girl with a book, but I can't read the entire first part. What is that? What terrifies? What is it? Religious extremists. What is it that says? Can you read it for us? No, you're on mute. You're
What
on mute,
terrified
Jean.
religious extremists like the Taliban are not American tanks or bombs or bullets. It's a girl with a book.
Read that again. Would you, and Trevor, read that again for us. What terrifies?
What terrifies religious extremists like the Taliban are not American tanks or bombs or bullets. It's a girl with a book.
Oh, interesting.
Amen. Thank you very much for helping me with that.
Yeah.
I think when we think about this evening's discussion and all the things that are sort of connected to it, I'm thinking of the connected book bans that have been going on throughout the country. And how many of us go to local school board meetings? And school board elections are going to be part of this year's elections. This year's election is not just about who's at the top of the ticket. It's you really have to take a look at what's going on right down the ballot. And I know there's a great deal of concern. I've been doing a lot of canvassing, and I've been canvassing. Well, I've been involved with elections for decades since I was a teenager. And very often you don't find people at home when you're canvassing. And I'm finding a lot of people home this year. And I'm also finding a lot of people want to talk, because a lot of people just don't want to be bothered, thank you, or go away, or what have you. And this year people want to talk. And it's just really great. It takes a long time to get down the block. I remind people, we've been saying where we are, if you're interested in voting for your county council, but I don't think it involves a school board. There was a confusion. In the state of Indiana, if you're living here in Indiana, if you vote straight ticket, then that will not include your at-large seats for a county council. There was a concern as to whether or not it included a school board. But I believe that a straight ticket would, but it would not include the at-large seats for a county council. Local elections are very, very important. And it's really at these local elections with the school boards and the county councils that it really begins what happens with the freedoms and the liberties we're talking about this evening. Because book bans are very much associated. You start to ban books, you ban information, then you began to allow a level of censorship that just lends itself to this evening's discussion. I want to thank you all for coming. It's been great. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Beau, and thank you, Don, very much. I know that Beau has to leave. He's got a little one he needs to attend to. And I know Sheila has to leave. Don says he's going to go to his lager and get something to drink. And if you'd like to, we're going to go into our nightcap session. So if you would like to, this is the time to sign off if you'd like. But if you want to go to your lager, I've been drinking water, but I think I'll go to my lager and get something stronger and come back. And we're going to carry on for another, at the most 30 minutes. We'll see how long. If you'd like to stay, I am going to ask you, if you do stay, to please turn on your cameras. So please do turn on your cameras. So as we have our conversation, we're not talking to your name that's written on an eraser board, but we're actually seeing you. So if you would please do that. And I'm going to slip away to my lager. Where is